Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'll be covering the Unbuilt architecture iceberg. This one primarily covers architectural designs that never got past the planning stage. It's a cool idea, and the iceberg is well done. Overall, I'm surprised that a video on it hasn't been made before, similar to that other iceberg I covered. For those that don't know, an iceberg chart covers a certain subject in detail. The further we go down this iceberg of information, the more obscure the entries become. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let's begin. The Palace of the Soviets. This structure would have been built near the Kremlin in Moscow, on the site of the demolished Cathedral of Christ the Savior. It was supposed to be a Congress Hall, an administrative center for the USSR. A contest was held to determine the look of this place. The winning entry to the competition was a neoclassical design by a man named Boris Iofan. It would have a great hall, capable of seating 20,000 people. However, a pair of men from the government committee named Schuko and Gelfreich had other ideas for Iofan's building. They wanted to make the world's tallest building and intended to create a great skyscraper topped by a statue of Lenin. Lenin would measure about 330 feet tall, which was a little bit more than his actual height when he still lived. The total height of the structure, Lenin included, would be 1,365 feet. Construction of the palace began in 1937, and a steel frame was installed. The German invasion in 1941 put a swift end to the project, as the frame was melted down to aid the war effort. Unbuilt Disney attractions. This is a large group of different entries, so I'll cover just a few proposed attractions in this category. Walt Disney wanted to create a park near his animation studio in Burbank, California. He began talks with some of his people in 1940 and expressed that he wanted a venue where people could meet the characters from his animations. World War II delayed his plans for a park. Tourism to California exponentially increased after the war, and many visitors from out of state wanted to go see the various movie studios. Disney had ideas for Mickey Mouse Park, a small park surrounded by a faux town square that had a hall, railroad station, and police and fire stations. A drugstore, opera house, toy repair shop, and vendor stands were also part of the plan. Disney wrote down the following in a memo to one of his friends. The police station will be put to practical use. Here, the visitors will report lost articles, lost kids, etc. We could have a little jail where the kids could look in. We might even have some characters in it. I'm not completely sure as to if the characters were supposed to be in the jail cells or in the station itself. The town council shot down the plans in 1952, and Disney moved his project to Anaheim. Another scrapped park would have been in St. Louis, Missouri. It was to be called Riverfront Square and would have been built in the late 1960s. It would be very similar to its attractions in the already constructed California location. Talks with the city council fell through in 1965. A popular urban legend says that Disney walked out of talks when August Busch Jr., a beer baron, disagreed with the plan to have the park be an alcohol-free zone. Finally, we have Disney's America. This historical theme park was going to be in Haymarket, Virginia. The park was part of a 10-year-long project announced by the company's CEO of the time, Michael Eisner, in 1990. He announced the Disney Decade, a time in which their theme parks would be increased across the US and the world. In 1991, Dick Nunis, a powerful company board member, went on a trip with Eisner to Williamsburg, a themed historical town in Tidewater, Virginia. They saw the success of the venture, and Nunis told Eisner of his plans for a historical amusement park. Eisner had just approved the production of Pocahontas and was easily sold on the idea. The company scouted Northern Virginia and brought up land outside of Haymarket. The site was less than a half-hour away from Dulles International Airport, which was to their advantage. They collected 10,000 acres by the fall of 1992. Eisner talked to Imagineers in 1992, who were responsible for creating attractions. He said the following: "Whatever we ultimately do, it should be built around a small number of emotionally stirring, heart-wrenching stories based on important themes in American history." The group discussed ideas involving the American Revolution and the experience of slaves and Native Americans in the early U.S. Eisner got support from the state governor, and they agreed to show up to the public announcement of Disney's America in November 1993. News leaked a few days before the announcement, and concerns formed in the public. The land was close to the Manassas National Battlefield Park. Local landowners, several of whom were quite wealthy, had retreats in the area and did not want to be disturbed. Interstate 66 was not ready to handle the traffic. The park was announced. Brochures were handed out to the attendees who arrived in Manassas for the conference. Sections of the park were themed around different parts of American history. However, a few days later, there was one major disturbing event in a follow-up conference held in Florida. Bob Weiss, the president of the Imagineers, said the following in the Civil War section: "We want to make you feel what it was like to be a slave or what it was like to escape through the Underground Railroad." This, with good reason, was met with massive amounts of backlash and contributed to the end of the project. I only learned about Weiss's comments when I did a deeper dive into Disney's America. A lot of modern sources are sympathetic to Disney and whitewash the events surrounding this park. Tor sans fins. This translates to tower without ends. The tower was going to be cylindrical, and the glass would lighten towards the top of it. This would give an illusion that the 103-story building was disappearing into the sky. Black granite, mica, aluminum, silk-screened glass, and other materials would be used to felicitate that effect. Several levels would be beneath the earth to secure the structure, and a seismic damper would employ vibrations to ensure that the tower stayed in place. The Tour sans fins would be 1,394 feet tall. It was designed by Jean Nouvel in the early 1990s and would be in a business district within Paris. The plans called for the start of construction in the mid-1990s and would see the tower finished at around the turn of the millennium. France was hit by an economic crisis, and the tower was cancelled. World capital, Germania. Hitler wanted to make Berlin a capital that paralleled and dwarfed the ancient cities of the Romans and Babylonians. He discussed his ideas with the architect Albert Speer in 1936, and assigned Speer to the project in 1937. Buildings in the Tiergarten and Alsen districts were razed to make space for these projects. Berliners were evicted from their homes and then resettled in housing that had been taken from Jewish families. New camps like Gross Rosen and Buchenwald were opened near quarries, and prisoners began to work to make bricks for the new buildings. Speer completed the large New Reich Chancellery in 1939, which was one of the first planned changes to Berlin's cityscape. Further plans called for the Tempelhof Airport, Olympic Stadium, Air Ministry, and other buildings to remain in Germania. Central Berlin would be divided by a massive Avenue of Splendors, which would be 4.3 miles long and would link two huge train stations. This avenue would be a no-go zone for pedestrians, who would use tunnels to pass below this section of the city. This place could also be used for parades, and traffic would be redirected to underground highways during these events. A 1,065,627 square foot Grand Hall, based off of St. Peter's Basilica, would be in the center of the city. Its amphitheater would be large enough to accommodate a crowd of 150,000. A nearby triumphal arch would be roughly 330 feet high, and the names of taken out German troops from World War I would be inscribed on it. Mother Canada Monument. Mother Canada was a 78-foot tall statue that would have been built in Nova Scotia. She would have been facing towards the open sea, in the direction where the Canadian National Vimy Memorial is, within France. It would be a memorial to the Canadians who died in foreign lands. Mother Canada would also include a museum, commemorative grounds, an information center, and a pathway. It was approved in 2015, but the National Parks Network of Canada disapproved of it being built within the boundaries of the Cape Breton Highlands National Park. Others disapproved of the patenting of the name Mother Canada by the private organization that wanted to build the statue. Critics also disliked the size of the statue, saying that it would clash with the surrounding landscape and disrupt the area. The project was cancelled in 2016. Lincoln Memorial Pyramid. It was 1911. Lawmakers had just approved the use of $2 million to construct a memorial to President Lincoln. A commission was made to determine the final design. The two contenders for the final round were Henry Bacon and John Russell Pope. Pope was inspired by Mesopotamia for his design, which was a 8-layer ziggurat adorned with a statue of Lincoln standing upright. His other submission was a pyramid with 4 portico entrances, one located on each side. Bacon's entry won, but many congressmen liked the pyramid. Cenotaph for Newton. Bouley, a French architect who lived from 1728 to 1799, was a big fan of Isaac Newton's work. He was fascinated by Newtonian physics and designed this monument. It was to be spherical, devoid of extreme ornamentation, and large. The sphere would be 500 feet in diameter and secured to a base that descended in 3 large tiers around the sphere. To the architect, this was an expression of his idea of perfection. Light would be altered by the sphere, giving it a neat gradation along its surface. Visitors could look into the inside of the sphere, which revealed a void. Newton's coffin would lie at the base of the monument at the center of gravity. Bouley's work would remain unpublished until long after his passing, only being given to the public in the 19th century. Liberty Memorial Proposal. The National World War I Museum in Kansas City features a memorial. It's a tall tower that was completed in 1926 and was later designated as the nation's official memorial dedicated to World War I. However, there were other proposals for the design. In 1921, designed by Thomas and William Drew and White, would have been a large obelisk surrounded by 6 buildings that would have been used to commemorate the sacrifices of the war. Another, from Walter Bliss and William Flavel, would consist of a circle of columns. 3 flags and a large altar would be within the circle. The entirety of the Battle Hymn of the Republic was to be inscribed on the altar. Democracy Uniting the World. This 1954 project intended to build a statue in San Pedro, California, that would rival the Statue of Liberty over on the East Coast. The LA County Supervisor of the time, a man named John Anson Ford, said the following in a promotion that would hopefully attract investors. The course of democracy is moving westward. The great nations around the Pacific Basin are looking to America, trying to discern whether our democracy is really something for all, or is in effect a concept reserved for the Anglo-Saxon. Communism tries with cunning and skill to alienate all of darker skin from the ideals that motivate our Western society. When this project becomes a reality, as it certainly must, countless millions will find their way to it, there to be inspired by its majestic symbolism, and there to learn something of the unending story of how democracy has inspired and blessed mankind. The structure would be 480 feet tall and mounted onto a 46-foot high base. A globe 125 feet in diameter would crown it. 3 250-foot tall figures would be holding up the globe and would represent the race's progression towards democracy. Art and historical museums would be located in the base of the statue. Democracy Uniting the World was scrapped after it was unable to receive adequate funding. The Phare du Monde Pleasure Tower. Phare du Monde, which translates to Lighthouse of the World, was a tower that was planned to be open to the public during the 1937 World Fair in Paris. It was going to be 2,300 feet tall, with a powerful light beacon and a restaurant designed to seat 2,000 guests on its top. It would be built from concrete, and a series of spiral ramps running up the tower led to a 500-car garage beneath the restaurant. Multiple elevators could also accommodate guests and allow them to access the top levels. Delta Dome. Modern-day Portland doesn't have a NFL football team. However, many city planners in the mid-1960s envisioned the city becoming the professional sports center of the Pacific Northwest. Delta Dome was crucial to this plan. It would consist of a modern covered stadium and would be built on the former site of Vanport City, a housing area for World War II dockyard workers that was wiped out by a flood in 1948. Flyers announced that the stadium would seat 46,730 people initially, although this could be expanded further to include, potentially, up to 100,000 people. It would park 17,000 cars and would be about 10 minutes from downtown, thanks to the new interstate system. Important local, political, and religious leaders promoted the stadium in the lead-up to the 1964 election to determine if money would be spent on this project. One supporter said the following before a college game in which Oregon played Stanford. The weather was predicted to be particularly miserable. Here's what he said. "I want the feeling of rain on the backs of the 20,000 voters in the stands, so that they will remember the Delta Dome on Election Day." However, the Delta Dome suffered a major setback in October 1964. 150,000 people in Portland received an advertisement for the stadium in the form of a booklet. However, many copies included a 12-page attached advertisement that attacked the current president, Lyndon Johnson. This was accidental, but many began to associate the Delta Dome project with the ad. The Dome vote results came in, and the city rejected the stadium. Seattle built the King Dome shortly after, and Portland lost that opportunity to field an NFL team. Torsos on Mount Rushmore. Gutzon Borglum was the sculptor chosen to guide the process of carving the images of 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. His original plan was to carve the images of the presidents from their heads to their torsos, but he was stopped due to the fact that he was already well over budget. Burnham Plan of Chicago. Daniel Burnham was a nationally renowned city planner. He helped design plans for Washington, D.C., Cleveland, and Manila in the Philippines, among many others. He resided in Chicago and wanted to help design the future of his home. He got a sponsor in the form of the Chicago Commercial Club and began work in 1906. He compiled his plans into a book which was released in 1909. Burnham wanted to improve the area around the city, not just within Chicago's current borders. Burnham's team ran calculations to estimate the city's growth by 1917 and aimed to improve the land outside the city limits. This would eventually be incorporated into Chicago, according to their projections. Another goal was to turn the lakefront in the south part of the city, which was an industrial dumping ground, into beautiful parkland that would be public property. Nearby bodies of water would feature artificial islands that could function as gathering places and retreats for the people of the city. These were just some of the things covered by the plan. Railroads and harbors would be upgraded as well, and athletic fields and libraries would be constructed. The most attractive part of the plan, at least to the groups that Burnham talked to, were the beautiful layouts and maps of future Chicago. Burnham's plans were ultimately rejected, but some of his design principles, such as calling for wider streets in the Metropolitan District, were worked into Chicago's development. 80 South Street. This piece of architecture is in limbo as of the time of recording. The building would be around 1,500 feet tall and would have 113 stories, making it the greatest of the super tall buildings in Lower Manhattan. This is an estimate, as the company developing the property, China Oceanwide, hasn't revealed the specifications. Triumphant Elephant, Paris. Charles Ribert was a French architect who lived in the 18th century. France had participated in a conflict called the War for Austrian Succession. Ribert wanted to make an elephant statue to commemorate the French victories during the war. The elephant would be near the Bastille and was hollow, featuring an indoor garden, an observation tower, and ballroom. Visitors could enter through an access hatch anchored to the ground beneath the elephant's belly. The design, which was submitted in 1758, a decade after the end of the war, was quickly rejected by the government. White House expansion. December 12, 1900, marked 100 years of Washington, D.C., being the seat of the federal government and the location of the president's home. William McKinley was in office at the time. A massive reception was being held at the White House. The centerpiece of the reception was a large plaster model made by Colonel Bingham, the superintendent of public buildings and grounds. Crowded working spaces would be replaced with brand new press rooms, reception areas, and offices in his design. Bingham gave a presentation on the history of the White House, but turned it into a sales pitch halfway through. Several architects were in attendance and openly criticized Bingham's plans during the presentation. The project was put on hold and then canceled after McKinley's assassination in 1901. A few of Bingham's better ideas were quietly worked into the plans for the restoration of the White House during Teddy Roosevelt's administration. Rockefeller Center, Metropolitan Opera. The original Metropolitan Opera House was opened in 1888 in Manhattan. It was said that the Metropolitan was obsolete the day it opened its doors. The performers and crews were affected by a lack of storage space, rehearsal space, and office space. Many different organizations attempted to move out of the place, and multiple attempts to relocate the Metropolitan failed. In 1955, Robert Moses, the city planner who made the Freedom Tunnel, which I covered in the last video, entered the scene. The Metropolitan banded together with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and began to map out ideas for a new music center. John D. Rockefeller III was contacted to oversee design proposals. Wallace K. Harrison, who had worked on buildings like the UN headquarters, was picked by Rockefeller. Harrison made some stunning designs for the new Met, but multiple designs were shot down due to either being over budget, lacking practicality, or straight up being too difficult to construct. Calvin Pollard's Washington Monument. This proposal from 1843 would have seen a Gothic tower with 4 levels made to commemorate George Washington being built in a park in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Pollard wanted the height of the tower to exhibit the way in which Washington dominated the landscape of American history. It would have been one of the tallest structures in the world at that time, measuring 425 feet tall. The city approved the project, and the cornerstone was laid in 1847. The public grew divided over the project soon after, and it was ended. National American Indian Memorial. Staten Island was almost the site of a memorial for the Native American tribes of the U.S. It would have been a building that had an art gallery, museum, and library. It would be topped by a 580-foot-tall statue of a man in tribal dress. The statue was designed by Daniel Chester, who was well known for his work on Lincoln's statue within the Lincoln Memorial. It would sit atop a ziggurat, which would in turn be on an Egyptian revival-style building. The memorial campaign, which began in 1908, was part of a push to give Native Americans full U.S. citizenship. President Taft gave his full support in 1913 and broke ground on the project. However, Woodrow Wilson would soon come into power, and the project was forgotten by the end of World War I. Fourth Grace. The Three Graces are historical landmarks within Liverpool, England, that were constructed near the port in the 1900s. Plans for a fourth grace, a piece of architecture that would further beautify the port, began in 2002. The city picked a design from the submissions of 4 renowned UK architects. William Alsop's The Cloud won, but the project ended after the cost of development grew to be too much. The other 3 contenders were the Liverpool Arch by Norman Foster, which was a large triangular tower, Lord Rogers' Wave of Light, which was a pair of towers connected by an arched roof, and Edward Cullinan's Globe Complex, which was a theater, 2 towers, a museum, a 5-star hotel, and a new yacht yard, all combined in one complex. Gaudi's New York Hotel. Gaudi's hotel attraction was designed in 1908 and would have been built in Lower Manhattan in New York City. This 1,181-foot-tall structure tapers towards the top in the sketches, and it almost resembles the central trunk of a saguaro cactus. The hotel's rooms were placed towards the bottom of the building, while the lecture halls and galleries were near the top. A small tower at the peak of the building could allow up to 30 people to enjoy a panoramic view of the New York skyline. Frank Lloyd Wright, Ellis Island. I've always enjoyed the style of some of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. Ellis Island was a place that had processed millions of immigrants by the time of its retiring in the 1950s. The government shut down their processing center there and put the island for sale. New York and New Jersey didn't have plans for the island's reuse, so the government instead offered the land commercially. 2 NBC executives, one a radio and one a television executive, had plans to buy the island. They contacted Wright in 1959 and gave their ideas for development. They wanted to make a prototype for a future city. He responded quickly, saying the following: "Your Ellis Island project is virtually made to order for me." They made plans to meet up on April 15th, 1959. Wright would pass away on the 9th, putting an end to all of his ideas. He had left behind some sketches for the island, which he called the Key Project. He envisioned a great central structure on the island that was anchored to the dockyard areas by a set of cables. It's kind of hard to describe. I'll read a short excerpt from a 1962 exhibit on the Key Project. It talked about the design there. A semicircular terrace is superimposed on the existing rectangular island. Apartment and hotel towers rise at the back, and domed theaters and shops are set into the terrace park. In the end, plans were canceled after Ellis Island was made part of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. Tokyo 1960. Tokyo had gone from possessing a population of 3.5 million in 1945 to almost 10 million by the late 1950s. City leaders were discussing solutions to the population boom. Kenzo Tange was an urban planner who drafted his ideas for improvements in the city as a whole and submitted them to the city council. Tange understood that the growing popularity of cars had changed the future of city planning. He designed a series of highways and subways, interlocking in gigantic loops that would ripple out from the downtown area. More loops containing transportation would be built as the city expanded outwards. Modular buildings would be taken on and off the loops as needed. Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Proposal. Former President Theodore Roosevelt passed away in 1919. Many of his admirers began to discuss building a memorial to honor him. John Russell Pope, who made the Jefferson Monument and other structures and submitted that pyramid design from earlier in the video, was contacted. His design would be on 16th Street Northwest. A fountain would be placed onto a small artificial island in an existing pond and would project a column of water over 200 feet into the air. Colonnades would be on the banks of the pond. The project was later scrapped, and an existing island in the Potomac was named after Teddy Roosevelt. Las Vegas National Sports Complex. This was proposed in 2011. The indoor arena would cost $650 million and would seat 17,500. A 63,500 capacity seat domed stadium, a baseball stadium, and a 25,000 seat open air stadium would be built there as well. The entire complex would be a multi-billion-dollar project. It was eventually scrapped and replaced by the Allegiant Stadium, currently used by the Raiders. Brittania Triumphant upon Greenwich Hill. This 1799 design was submitted by John Flaxman and was designed to commemorate Britain's victory in the Battle of the Nile. Its full name was Brittania by Divine Providence Triumphant. It measured 230 feet high and would depict Brittania, who, in this example, looks similar to most depictions of the Greek goddess, Athena. Flaxman's other idea was a large victory arch. The war against the French continued, and the funds for victory statues and arches were severely limited. Full Moon Hotel. This hotel was going to be in Baku, Azerbaijan. The hotel possessed 382 luxurious rooms across 35 floors, and the podium on which it rested would hold 2 apartment complexes. Thousands of honeycomb-shaped panels covered its surface and glowed incandescent, cool colors. It's noted that the hotel looked a little like the Death Star from a certain angle in the renderings, which came out in 2008. It remains unbuilt. Alexander the Great statue in Mount Athos. This one is one of my favorites on the Iceberg. The story goes as follows. Alexander the Great was passing judgment on the people in his territory near Mount Athos in northeastern Greece. A young Macedonian named Dinocrates arrived in the region and pulled Alexander aside once he was done passing judgment. He showed him sketches for a Mount Athos project. A side of the mountain would be formed into a statue of Alexander, seated on a throne in full battle dress. One hand would hold a carved bowl in which the mountain's springs would collect, and the other would rest upon a new city. Alexander was impressed by Dinocrates' ambition, but pointed out flaws in the infrastructure of the city. He sent the architect to survey the area of present-day Alexandria, and Dinocrates went on to design Alexandria itself. Olympic Village in Long Island City. A competition to design a new area within Long Island began in September 2003. New York City was in the finals for a competition to determine who would host the 2012 Olympics. They wanted a complex to host the competitors. 130 submissions from over 20 countries were accepted. The final pick was Thom Mayne's Morphosis. Ribbon-like residential buildings would parallel the East River and had space to house up to 16,000 athletes. It would become housing after the Olympics ended. New York City lost the bid to London, and the Olympic Village idea was scrapped. Frank Lloyd Wright's The Illinois. Wright held a small press conference in 1956, where he announced the Illinois. This Chicago super-tall skyscraper would be a mile high and possessed 528 stories, 76 elevators with compartments that were 5 stories high, could deliver people to 5 different floors at each stop. They would be atomic-powered and go at speeds of up to 60 miles an hour. Wright said that the Empire State Building, which is 1,454 feet tall at its tip, would be a mouse in comparison. The Illinois would have 18 million square feet of space, around 3 times as much as the entirety of the Pentagon, and could hold 100,000 people. Wright called it a city in the sky, as it would have had a heliport and a docking hangar, with space for around 100 small aircraft. Railways and 4 major highways would connect to it, and a parking garage for 15,000 cars was available. Wright was inspired by trees when he plotted out the foundation, with 15 subfloors heavily anchored into the ground, supporting the tower above. A solid concrete and steel core would anchor the entire building. Unfortunately for Wright, no one wanted the tower, and he was unable to attract any clients. King's Cross Airport. Charles W. Glover, a noted architect, submitted his idea for a central airport for London in 1931. His airport looks like a wheel in the sketches. The spokes in the wheel were a half-mile long and served as runways for aircraft. London had no skyscrapers at the time, meaning that this area north of St. Pancras would have no obstructions for aircraft taking off and landing at the King's Cross Airport. Garages below the runways would store private airplanes, which would be taken up to the runway by lifts. Personnel and passengers would reach the runway from the buildings below in the same manner. Planes would taxi around the wheel rim until they got clearance from the control tower, which was below the wheel. North River Bridge. The North River Bridge would have connected the city of Hoboken, New Jersey, to Manhattan. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company began lobbying for this project in the 1880s. They wanted a direct link from their rail line near the Hudson River into New York City. Gustav Lidenthal was contacted to build the bridge. He designed many great bridges before. He created the plans for a 3,100-foot-long bridge that spanned from Manhattan's 23rd Street to the intersection of Garden and 12th in Hoboken. The suspension bridge would have 10 train tracks, making it the largest rail bridge of the time. A total of $40 million in 1880s money would be needed to acquire land and then build the bridge. Congress was contacted for approval, and the government agreed to the project. Multiple properties were bought up by the company in 1892 in Hoboken. The Great Financial Panic of 1893 slowed the project, and the cornerstone was put in place 2 years later in 1895. Continued economic crises slowed the project, and it was eventually made obsolete by the Hudson Tubes. These tunnels allowed trains to pass between New Jersey and New York City. The Pennsylvania Railroad decided to pursue underwater tunnels instead. The cornerstone of the North River Bridge is currently in front of the Stevens Institute Library. The Wolkenbugel. This name translates to cloud iron, which sounds like a AC call sign. Cloud iron was designed by L. Lisitsky in 1925. These consisted of 8 identical 164-foot-tall buildings that would rest on massive pylons. L-shaped buildings would be on top of the trunk of the pylon. These contained 3 stories of space. The pylons would serve a dual purpose, anchoring the structures and enabling access to subway stations. They would be placed on the intersections of the Boulevard Ring within Moscow. Skyscraper Bridges. This most likely relates to the Raymond Hood design. Hood constructed the Rockefeller Plaza, Tribune Tower in Chicago, and many other structures throughout the 1920s and 30s. He was interested in reducing the sprawl of great American cities of the time. He proposed a suspension bridge made for New York City that would house multiple towers throughout its length. These 60-story buildings contained many apartments, shops, theaters, and riverside resorts, which would be placed beneath the bridges. He collected his ideas and published them in a proposal called New York 1950. A writer covering Hood's design, Oric Johns, admired the ideas for New York. He wrote this in a 1925 New York Times article. Land has often been reclaimed from water for purposes of habitation and agriculture. What is so extraordinary about creating land over water? Hood said that these bridges would span the Hudson and East River, creating additional space for development. Friedrichstrasse Skyscraper. Only skyscrapers under construction reveal bold constructive thoughts, and the impression of a high-reaching steel skeleton is overpowering. This is a paraphrase of what Mies van der Rohe said when he unveiled his Skin and Bones skyscraper. Berlin had started a competition in 1921 to determine the look of its first skyscraper. It would be in the shopping district of Friedrichstrasse near a large train station. Roy called his entry Honeycomb. It was radically different from the other entries, many of which used Gothic and classical elements for their more moderate skyscraper layouts. This skyscraper had large sheets of glass that hung like a curtain off of the central structure. It was an open frame surrounded by glass. The entry lost the competition, but many other architects became inspired by the honeycomb. Coney Island Globe Tower. Coney Island was being developed as a retreat in the 1880s, and many hotels, racetracks, and restaurants were constructed. By 1906, there was little space left for development. Samuel Freed, an entrepreneur and architect, submitted designs for the Globe Tower. This 11-floor, 700-foot-high globe would contain restaurants, a bowling alley and vaudeville theater, 4 circus rings, a ballroom, a weather observation station, and an aerial hippodrome. Hippodromes are stadiums for horse and chariot races. The project received financial support from the public, but the Globe Tower remained unbuilt. It was revealed to be a hoax. 1877 London Tower Bridge design. London in the 1870s possessed one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. It was said to be possible to cross between the northeast of London and southeast by stepping from ship to ship. A bridge needed to be built to allow access between different parts of the city, but the shipping lanes couldn't be interrupted. Options from architects included the current London Bridge, a tunnel, and Joseph Bazalgette's crossing. Bazalgette was the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. His crossing would use a pair of spiral ramps that would ascend high into the air, connecting at a level crossing that wouldn't interfere with the shipping. Linear cities. The urban planner Arturo Mata proposed this concept in 1882. The linear city would be a 1,640-foot wide strip, with services packed at each end of the strip. Residential buildings would be between the service areas. These strips would make up the city. Ciudad Lineal, within the city of Madrid, was an attempt to implement the concept. The other important figure in the history of linear cities is Edgar Chambliss, whose work dates to the early 1900s. He took a map of the US and drew a straight line in the center of the country, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He envisioned a linear city running from coast to coast. 3 rail lines would run down the expanse, and homes, services, and parks would be built on a roof over the railroad. Gonna say this would be horrendous unless there was sufficient noise dampening between the homes and the railroad. He called this place Road Town. It would combine the convenience of the city with the beauty of the countryside. His plan would run through the Rockies, the Mississippi, and the Allegheny Mountains. The Russians and French would also make plans for linear cities in the 1930s, although their ideas were also rejected. The Russian architect, Mikhail Okhtovich, was later taken out in Stalin's Great Purge, partially for his linear design. Unlike many other entries, this one has a chance of being built. Saudi Arabia announced the line in 2021. This 105-mile-long city would use linear design, with habitation and services being inside of a semi-transparent structure. City Tower, Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn's hometown was Philadelphia. This architect was involved with several projects within the city during the 1950s. The City Tower was planned to be constructed at 1400 Arch Street. This 30-story tower was composed of plates formed from hexagons with tinted glass and painted metal, giving it a dark exterior. The tower zigzagged up its length and had K'NEX-like external cladding. It was planned to be completed in the late 1960s. Vinnie Hoxie, Washington Monument. Hoxie was a talented sculptor who lived from 1847 to 1914. She is best known for her sculpture of Abraham Lincoln, which is enthroned in the Lincoln Memorial. The information on this entry was very scarce. I was able to find a sketch of hers from 1878. It's a blurry architectural drawing that depicts a squatter version of the Washington Memorial Obelisk, with a statue of Washington perched on the top of the obelisk. The figures within the image are pretty small next to it, so it was still going to be a towering monument. Pneumatic Elevated Railway. Rufus Henry Gilbert was born in New York State in 1832. He served as a Union surgeon during the Civil War. He then took a trip to Europe after the war and saw the state of many slums in heavily populated European cities. He thought that a great quality of life improvement for the poor would be fast and affordable transit. His thoughts were that this efficient transportation would allow the poor to enjoy the countryside. He patented the elevated railway in 1870. 9-foot wide tubes, supported by Gothic-style arches and Corinthian columns, would run through major districts. He planned for the system to be implemented in New York City. Passengers would enter transport vehicles in the tubes, and then the transport would be shot through the system by compressed air. Stations would be about a mile apart, and would use pneumatic elevators to allow passengers to reach the tubes from the street. Telegraphs would signal arrival and departures from each station. Gilbert's ideas were approved by the state legislature in 1872, but the economic panic of 1873 ended the plans for the pneumatic railway. Gilbert went on to develop the elevated railway, which used steam-powered trains to transport passengers. The elevated railway was later opened in 1878 within New York City. Das Große Berlin, Karl Paul Andrae. All of the articles I could find on Paul Andrae were in German. They were translatable, so I found some stuff on this designer. Andrae was born in Dresden in 1886. He's most well known for his drawing collection, called Greater Berlin, which was released between 1913 and 1916. none of the designs in the collection were ever built. He sketched residential buildings and warehouses that were the size of skyscrapers. The scale of many of them are gargantuan, but some of his interior designs have intriguing setups. Beacon of Progress. This sketch depicts the Beacon of Progress. These tiny figures who dot the image are people. The scale of the beacon is insane. It would measure 1,500 feet tall, 46 feet higher than the Empire State Building. It was created by Professor C. Despradel. Despradel was inspired to create this concept when he visited the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He was a fresh graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. These schools produced many famous artists throughout the 19th century. He was impressed by the U.S. and began to work on a monument to honor the history of the nation. Despradel said the following about the project. All the forces which have shaped the American nation marshaled themselves in the form of a glorious monument, the symbol of progress and grandeur. He would engrave, "To the glory of the American people," at the base of this beacon. Lions would adorn massive balconies that led up to the base of the tower. It would rest in Jackson Park in Chicago. He began work on the beacon in 1894 and showed off the drawings in Paris in 1900. He drew inspiration from the imagery of the Tower of Babel for his beacon, and one sketch depicted it next to other historical landmarks like the Eiffel Tower and Great Pyramids. It won a gold medal in the Paris Salon competition of 1900 and was displayed for many years in Luxembourg as an example of modern architecture. Le Corbusier, city for 3 million inhabitants. Le Corbusier was a French-Swiss architect who wanted to use the tech improvements of the industrial age to improve human life. He was a modernist, focusing on the efficiency of the buildings he made. He was well established as an architect by the early 1920s, which was when he unveiled his first urban plan. It was called the Contemporary City, made to house 3 million people. The city had a central business district of 24 identical glass skyscrapers, with parks between each. Open space would contain public squares, theaters, restaurants, and other facilities. Each skyscraper would have a tube station beneath it. These, in turn, fed into a transportation system. Raised highways and aerodromes for air taxis would ensure efficient transportation at every elevation. Housing would consist of low-rise buildings around the business district, with garden cities existing outside the housing. These cities within the countryside would be separated from the main city by woods, fields, and sporting grounds. He attempted to get support for the demolition of central Paris to test his idea, but this was opposed by many. Maisons tours Phare. This translates to tower houses of Phare. Auguste Phare's tower houses were 656 feet high and would serve as residential complexes. His plans, which date to 1922, would have called for 100 of these structures to be built on a grid from the Forest of Lay to the present-day site of the La Défense business district. Royal Palace on the Acropolis. This palace would be placed on the Athenian Acropolis. It was designed by the architect Schinkel and was for Otto von Wittelsbach, who had been elected King of Greece in 1832. The palace would be built in a classical style, with colonnaded buildings surrounding a garden that was crowned with a great statue of Athena. The Parthenon would be restored. The entire complex would be a residence for the King of Greece. The plans were shot down due to economic crises in the region. The Manhattan Dome. Buckminster Fuller was an inventor, architect, and urban futurist, among other things. He also loved domes. His 1960 proposal went as follows. A dome would be constructed beginning at 42nd Street in Manhattan and extending for about 2 miles. This dome would be designed to conserve energy by keeping a temperate environment within the interior. This would ensure that those living within the dome would have to pay less for AC and heating. Other benefits included water conservation through siphoning water coming off of the surface of the dome. He used New York as an example of the benefits of the dome design. His thoughts were that the dome would never be built within his lifetime. He said that the design would be particularly useful in the water-starved sections of various states, or in particularly harsh winter climates. City of New Manhattan, 1911. This set of manuscripts were developed by T. Kennard Thompson between 1911 and 1931. He was a respected engineer who worked on many major infrastructure projects within New York City. He planned to enlarge Manhattan by building new peninsulas within the Hudson River. This would be accomplished through filling in the space and then paving it with asphalt, providing an additional 50 square miles of space for which the city could grow into. He altered the scope and purpose of New Manhattan in the late 1920s, instead suggesting the development of a 10 square mile strip of land between Manhattan and New Jersey. This could reduce traffic congestion by providing space for roads and subway tunnels. His plans attracted attention, and many within the city council considered supporting him. Drain the East River. This proposal was submitted by John A. Harris, a deputy police commissioner in New York City, responsible for traffic. The concept was published in Popular Science in 1924. It would drain the East River. The article discussed what would follow. From the riverbed would be built subway lines, vehicular subway, taxi stands, conduit, city equipment departments, parking spaces, and private and municipal garages. On the top level would be 5 100-foot boulevards for autos and pedestrians. Ramps would be provided for cross-traffic. Play cloud, nameless. This project from 2010 involves Governor's Island near Manhattan. The island was closed to the public, and the architecture group Nameless wanted to draw public attention to the island. Their proposal was an inflatable jellyfish-like structure called Play Cloud. The tendrils of Play Cloud would be made out of white yarn. It would be large enough to be clearly visible from Manhattan, which is 800 yards away. Visitors would be allowed to touch, lean, and sit on the structure. These actions would cause it to sway. Changes in air pressure would give Play Cloud the appearance of breathing, and cause it to sway in a motion similar to that of a swimming jellyfish. It was classified as a pavilion, and could be easily folded up to be stored when not in use. Its yarn would be taken off after each season and replaced. The old yarn would be used to make socks, which would be sold in a visitor's pavilion on Governor's Island. Alright, I'm going to cover a handful of additional entries in this bonus tier. I typically put these at the end of my Iceberg videos. Let's begin. Euthenasia Coaster. Making this video without mentioning the Euthenasia Coaster would be similar to making an Ohio iceberg without covering Harambe. Julie Jonas Urbanus was a Lithuanian man who made plans for a fatal theme park attraction. He described it as a hypothetic death machine in the form of a roller coaster, engineered to humanely, with elegance and euphoria, take out a human being. The coaster would have space for 24 occupants. It would ascend to a peak of 510 feet in the air. At this point, the passengers would be given one last opportunity to stop and exit the ride. After this decision, those who remained on the coaster would all have to press a button to start the ride. They would then experience the drop at speeds of around 223 miles per hour before entering a series of loops that would gradually get smaller in size. This would render the passengers unconscious before taking them out by cutting off oxygen going to the brain. Los Angeles Civic Center. New York's gotten a lot of love on this iceberg, so I decided to at least find one more cool entry from the West Coast. This sketch was produced by Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright. He submitted this to a design contest that took place in 1925. The aim was to brainstorm ways in which downtown LA could be transformed. This massive complex would be built on Grand Avenue. It was a series of buildings placed in descending tiers that sloped down from off of a hill. The city hall would be at the top, and civic buildings and administration below. Massive terraces would be along these tiers. Cars, subways, and trains would move underground beneath the Civic Center. New Harmony, Indiana. This little town of 687 people exists on the banks of the Wabash River within Indiana. It was bought from a religious community by the British industrialist Robert Owen in 1825. He had plans to form a socialist community. The following sketch, which was composed of 4 factories and a park surrounded by a square made out of residential apartments, was to be the final form of New Haven. Owen said the following about his beliefs. There is but one mode by which man can possess in perpetuity all the happiness which his nature is capable of enjoying. That is by the union and cooperation of all for the benefits of each. He attracted a group of scientists, workers, and thinkers to follow his cause. New Harmony soon had a population of 800 people. He greeted his residents by giving a speech about the evils of individual property. From that point onwards, the experiment began. Within less than a year, it had failed. The community was unable to produce enough food, as hard-working workers realized they earned the exact same benefits as those who were slacking off. The New Haven complex remained unbuilt. Lagos Bamboo Stadium. Lagos, Nigeria, a city of 16 million, held a competition in 2019. The idea was to take the site of the massive Olusosun landfill and transform it into a green space within the city. Bamboo Stadium was the winner. Images depicted the formation of a bamboo forest within the space of the cleared landfill. After the bamboo took root, it would be used to create modular buildings, such as a community center, indoor courts for sports like basketball, and a full football/soccer field. LAX Skylounge. This would consist of a helipad at LAX Airport and a Metroport in downtown LA. Buses full of passengers would be picked up from the airport by massive helicopters and deposited at the Metroport in the downtown area. This was designed to reduce traffic congestion. It was created by the design team of LAX in the early 1960s. Alright, that's it for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I enjoyed the opportunity to talk about this iceberg. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking the video and check out some of the other topics I've covered on this channel. There's also links to support me in the description. I'll see you in the next video. Take care, and good night.